Northern Ireland, a small step to a giant adventure. Book your next giant adventure at discovernorthernireland.com.
Hi, I'm Sarah Meekin. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist and I'm head of psychological services in the Belfast Trust. Thank you very much for the invitation to do this presentation at this time. I hope you'll find it interesting and enjoyable. I'm going to share my screen with you, hopefully, and so I think that is working. So I'm hoping to have a conversation, which I suppose is part of what all of our conversations over the last year and a half have been around viral spread, but I don't want to talk about COVID too much. I would like to think a little bit about what can we in the midst of COVID times learn or relearn and think about how we implement or use differently the knowledge that we have about how we can spread emotions and behaviours. And think a little bit, can some of the science of psychology help us a little bit in thinking about what we want for ourselves as individuals, but also for the societies in which we live and the organisations in which we find ourselves in order to have, I suppose, more positive lives and better outcomes in terms of those. So that's what I'm interested in thinking a little bit with you over the next 30 minutes or so. I guess it's been a bit of a year or two almost. One of the things I think we've probably all found recently is the challenge of kind of knowing what day it is and feeling as if in some ways we've lost a year. And I know that definitely that's part of even my children's experience in terms of school and certainly for the rest of us trying to add an extra year on when we calculate when we did things. And the headlines have been challenging and difficult, and we've had to face a lot of challenges in terms of our homes, our businesses, our work environments, and it's been difficult over the last while. And we've been able to observe some interesting behaviours, even just within the supermarkets. Probably everyone has a story to tell about some of the challenges that we've had individually in our own behaviours or perhaps in those around us. And I guess who knew that all Northern Ireland needed to function was toilet rolls, pasta and alcohol. We might have had a bit of a guess of the last one, but I don't think I would have ever thought that we'd have seen a run on toilet rolls. But we can think a little bit about what are some of the factors that might have contributed to that as we think through some of these issues of how do things get caught or spread. And I think certainly I'm going to take personal ownership of days whenever we really feel, or I certainly feel the idea of I can't adult today, or looking for someone who might take charge in the room. This is one of my son's favourite sayings, him not having quite accepted that often actually he is now that adult in the room. But there are challenges, I think, in just feeling a bit overwhelmed and exhausted. And I guess needing maybe to take a moment of pause and reflect as to where we are, but also more importantly, maybe where we would like to be. And sometimes I suppose these big societal events have that opportunity just to help us rethink a little what we wish for the future. The kind of language that we have learned to use in our everyday conversations over the last year and a half has obviously changed as well. And discussing PPE, wearing face masks, talking about infection control no longer is just the remit of health services. It's become something that all of us have to think about in our houses. We have to think about it when we go shopping, and businesses have to consider it. All of us have had to think about it in terms of how we arrange offices, etc. So these concepts of PPE and infection control, which may have been more focused in certain areas, for example, healthcare, have become very commonly discussed and used, and we're all very familiar with what we need to do in order to have better infection control, and also in terms of protecting ourselves and each other. And I guess, like all good psychologists, we've taken some of these concepts and the fact that there's a high frequency of usage of those to also help promote some psychological messages as well. So as examples within the trust, we've started to think a little bit around not just what's our physical PPE, but also what is our psychological PP, and thinking about messaging then around things that can be helpful to promote our well-being and I suppose keep our psychological well-being in mind as well as our physical. And we've done the same in terms of thinking about psychological infection control as well as physical infection control. So these have become, I suppose, physical words which normally are attributed to maybe a more medical sphere that we now have begun to use in a much more psychological context. And even in thinking about that, we can see contagion effects of constructs and language as it moves from one realm to another. And that's something that we do very naturally with a desire to, I suppose, influence. And I mean, we deliberately chose to use some of that language because we knew it was, I suppose, high octane language at the moment. People were likely to pay attention to it, and we could get them to start to think not just about their physical needs, but also their psychological at a time whenever stress was high. And I suppose just in reflecting some of the last year and a half or so, it's also important to remember that this is not new, that challenge and stress, and particularly within a Northern Ireland context where we've had many challenges in our past, not just within kind of health areas, but within society and in the challenges of the troubles and all that Northern Ireland have faced, and that has led to other challenges in terms of increased mental health difficulties in our population. We've always had more problems with our waiting lists, as you can see, and that was before the pandemic. So the notion of living in challenge or under pressure, and it's not a new concept for us. And I suppose that is both helpful and challenging. We know that additional challenge on top of challenge can result in increased vulnerability. But we also know the opposite can be true, that times of challenge and having come through them can also lead to increased resilience and increased skill set. So it's how do we manage an increased vulnerability and promote the increased potential for resilience and the increased skills that we may have learnt over the challenges of the past. What can be helpful to us in that messaging? And throughout managing many of those challenges, both in the past and throughout the COVID, we have had different ways of trying to promote both individual well-being, and I say that kind of messaging around how to help support ourselves, but also how to support each other, and the concept of psychological first aid and making sure that we check in on each other and providing supports both within communities and workplaces are a common theme. We may not always feel we have enough or sufficient of them, but they are a key part of how we live our lives and try to influence the lives of each other as well. And sometimes actually kind of words become common and can be almost have a bit of a backlash. And we would have talked a lot about resilience a couple of years ago. Almost find people have a negative feeling about the word resilience, and I can understand the concepts and the context in which that happens. And I think one of the challenges as we sometimes kind of psychological constructs and words become part of our everyday language is the challenge of how do we ensure that and they get adapted in their truest forms. So concepts such as resilience and compassion are not just individual constructs or things that individually we want for ourselves. In order to have meaning and impact, we need to ensure that they also have community and organizational delivery as well. And I really like this quote in terms of resilience, particularly around thinking of organizations or communities or societies, that really the goal of resilience is to focus us on our future rather than necessarily take us back to our past. And I think in a Northern Ireland context that has a lot of resonance for many of us. But also I think in looking at where we find ourselves today, that's a bit important thing for us to hold in mind. Where do we want to move towards? And how do we take the lessons, the skill set, the resilience that we have learned in the past forward with us, and how that can be helpful in trying to create a new future that might be a more positive future than what we faced in the past. So So I suppose in thinking about that, and as we start maybe in the hope of COVID becoming something in the past, we want to look then ahead and think about, well, what is next? We were thinking of those ideas in our organisations, in our teams, in our families perhaps, but we want to have that conversation as a wider community, a wider society, within a Northern Ireland context, and maybe within a Belfast context as well. And I guess the question in thinking about this idea of kind of contagiousness or contagions, for me was beginning to ask, well, what is it that we want to catch or spread? With this idea that actually we are not just at risk of viruses and physical challenges, but also within a psychological context, that emotions and behaviours can be in many ways just as, if not more, contagious than diseases, and actually can have an equally detrimental impact on the way in which we live, and our health and well-being. Apologies, the sunshine's getting a little bit bright, so I'm just going to close the curtain here a bit. Hopefully that's better. Grateful for it, because it's been absolutely pouring here today, so nice to see a bit of sun again. That helps us all, a bit of a contagion effect of sunshine. So I want to briefly just touch on the idea of positive psychology. It's been something that's been in discussion a little bit within our trust, and I think within the wider Belfast community. And I suppose just to think a little bit about what can this idea of positive psychology, alongside this issue of sort of social contagion effects, how can these be helpful in influencing our thinking around the future that we might want to build? So what is positive psychology, I guess, is a good place to start. And it really has a focus on studying what is it that makes life most worth living, and has a focus very much on kind of meaningful lives, a focus on strengths that enable both individuals and communities to thrive and to prosper, if it was. The idea being very much that our source of energy is not in the things that we control, because actually they are possibly few sometimes, but actually in our connection to purpose. And if we can find shared purposes, and a kind of our own individual connection to purpose, then actually that leads to more meaningful lives, which in itself leads to more positive outcomes, even in the midst of challenge. So that sounds great. Why would that be a challenge? And also, you know, what are the, I suppose, the roadblocks that might be in front of us in terms of trying to promote that kind of psychology? And I suppose one of the challenges is sometimes just a little bit about how we've done things in the past. And I think this is a challenge wherever you are, probably, in that we tend to live in cultures and in situations that often promote what we lack, as a way to, I suppose, create growth. You know, so I'm thinking in health. You know, we're often looking at what isn't available. So it is looking at waiting lists, it's looking at pathology, it's looking at psychological morbidity, it's looking at mental health problems. And we can understand why that is the case. And so we tend to talk about sort of the negative, and even within sort of mental health world, we tend to ask what's wrong with you, and actually we've started, I suppose, to challenge that a little bit. And there's a middle ground here, which is a little bit around what's happened to you and understanding the context in which challenges and problems and difficulties present. And so work that's been done around adverse childhood events, work that's been done around trauma informed, has all, if you like, almost bridged this gap between kind of the negative and what's wrong and what our deficits are. And I guess what positive psychology is trying to do is ask a slightly different question. So looking at, well, what's right with you, and what's going well, what do you find satisfying, what things are important to you, what things are meaningful for you, and really trying to shift the conversation. And one of the challenges to that is that if the systems around us don't function to support those types of conversations, then actually having those conversations can actually lose out. So if we're looking for funding to potentially promote sort of areas that we know people find meaningful or have satisfaction, we may well lose out against crisis areas or areas where that the kind of voice is louder around the challenge or the gaps or the deficits that exist. So positive psychology does require a systemic approach to it in order to have success. Otherwise, I guess we know in whatever situation we find ourselves, crisis always trumps conversation. And it's important for us to keep that in mind if we want to have different conversations. Those conversations will need to be supported across the systems and the societies and the communities that we find ourselves. One of the other challenges is just how we frame things, so particularly if we think about sort of in a psychological context, much of what we're going to talk about is behaviours which are often driven by emotions. And we have a tendency to think of emotions as either positive or negative, when actually emotions are just that. They are our feelings, and kind of what we label them is often socially constructed or driven by some other need or and yet it's important to kind of every now and then remind ourselves why the things that we call negative emotions aren't necessarily negative, and just to be mindful of our language at times in that. So we've had, I suppose, the kind of phraseology, particularly over COVID, but pre that, of it's okay not to be okay. And I think that's been an important message, in just, I suppose, assuring people of the normality of their emotions at this time of kind of high challenge and high stress and sort of unprecedented times, really. But in some ways, it still reinforces a message of not okay, which in itself suggests that there's a problem with that emotion. And I quite like the fact that actually this slide maybe just talks more about acknowledging the emotion and that emotion being okay, that it is appropriate in the circumstances in which we find ourselves, rather than in any way potentially contributing to a conversation that suggests that, again, there's a deficit within that, or the way that we feel in terms of not being okay. So there's something about being kind of mindful and careful and thoughtful and having conversations about language, reducing stigma, making support available to people are all really important, and in no way would I want to suggest that we don't continue to do that. But sometimes we risk the over pathology of normal emotions in our attempt to make sure that we are providing support, and we need to just, I suppose, have an eye to a caution of that. Also, the importance of the gamut of emotions that we experience. I'm a big fan of the movie Inside Out. I don't know if everyone's seen it or not. If you haven't, I suggest that you watch it. It's a fantastic sort of look at emotional kind of the gamut of emotions that we have, how we are driven by emotions, the importance of a range of emotions, and also how we store memories and kind of how we move towards sort of developmental phases in terms of that. So really wonderful, full of psychology film. But I love the quote in terms of, without the hard times, how would we know when we're in the good times? And over the last while, I think the whole concept of, we've had losses over COVID, but I think also there are things that we have gained in terms of reappreciating perhaps each other, our families, the simple pleasures of going for a walk whenever lots of other things weren't available to us. So they wouldn't want to live in that, and often that quote of, well, I can appreciate the lesson now that it's passed, but I wouldn't necessarily have chosen to have taken it. But the importance of really, I suppose, celebrating and understanding and taking on board the importance of that gamut range of emotions, and how actually they are important in the range as well as in the experience. I love the fact that actually apparently some psychologists claim there are 27 emotions, and would be interesting to take the time to kind of try and round them off. But just, I suppose, a reminder of the complexity that we are in terms of our experiences of the events in which we find ourselves, and how that can be very different across people. And sometimes we almost assume that we're in the same situation with the same emotion, and obviously that is not always the case. So as well as kind of, I suppose, thinking a little bit about our emotional range and the impressiveness of it, we just need, if we're going to talk about positive psychology, if we're going to talk about, I suppose, the contagion, potential spread of emotions or behaviours, just to be kind of mindful and to keep thinking about, well, how do we manage emotions normally? And that would be a whole other talk in itself. But some of the work that Paul Gilbert has done around what are our emotional regulation systems, how do they get activated, how do we pay attention to them, is really worth looking at, because we can't, I suppose, choose or look at or have conversations about how we spread emotions or what the contagion effect of emotions are if we don't have a good idea of how we manage our own emotions. And we don't pay attention to that. The management of our emotions will be a big part of being able to understand and take an awareness of the potential spread and contagion of them. And these are all linked to, obviously, our brain function in terms of the type of emotions that we have and the way in which we regulate them. And again, just keeping that in mind in terms of the different layering within our brains in terms of complexity and what we do sometimes just by default, because it's the way we're set up to, versus the ability to think things through, all being important parts of how we move that forward. So there are lots of, I guess, other interesting conversations that we could have around kind of how we regulate emotions, what that might look like, how our brain is involved in that, and how we can support ourselves and each other to find better ways of managing emotions as well. And none of this is new. I mean, a lot of it is used in advertising, and I suppose one of the challenges for us is a lot of it is done almost unconsciously. And so part of this, I suppose, is really about trying to raise awareness of our emotions, but also the ability for them to be manipulated. And I'm going to talk a bit about not just by others, but also by ourselves. And I was thinking a bit about those kind of three colors in the regulation of emotions, the kind of red brain, which is that threat brain. If we think about all our seatbelt ads, they were very designed to kind of hit and trigger us around anxiety and fear and blame and all the kind of emotions that we often label as negative. But it was, in terms of delivering a message or provoking an emotional reaction, it was our lower level threat brain that we're really looking at trying to activate. The blue brain is kind of about our motivation. It's almost in some ways about our competitiveness possibly coming out, or interest in getting engaged in activities that interest us, or having a learning point, all the things, I suppose, that are motivators and drivers and rewards for us. And there was an interesting little study done around home shopping, and they noted that they used to say at the end of the home shopping channel that operators are waiting to take your call. And then as part of some kind of thinking around, well, how does language influence action? They changed it to, if our operators are busy, please call again. And the surge in calls was quite significant. And I suppose that was partly around that suggests other people want that product. So there's kind of a, well, if you want to get in, it might be gone. So it's all the triggers that might have in our brains. And then our green brain is our soothe brain, the kind of the connection of trying to look after ourselves. How do we form those connections, feel safe, feel comforted? And the Kit Kat Take a Break commercials are a good example of that even though they were red in color, the connection was linking a natural trigger of take a break, which is kind of part of everybody's sort of hoped for day, with the activity of having a Kit Kat, and being able to link those together as almost a soothe activity, something that would comfort us, something that gave us some time out, but again, increase sales of Kit Kat quite considerably. So a lot of this goes on in our day-to-day life. If we look at, there's lots of complaints about Facebook and what they put up and how they link into things that we're interested in. And a lot of it's happening without us even realizing it. So the importance of raising the profile of contagion effects and the way that socially we can be contaminated by each other, by ourselves, and also by wider agendas that we sometimes aren't even aware of, should be a part of our conversations moving forward. So we can contaminate ourselves, and that's really important. And that's really not a new concept either. I love the fact that Marcus Aurelius in ancient Rome was already talking about the kind of quality of our thinking being important in our happiness. And we've got a whole therapeutic milieu in terms of cognitive behavior therapy that is very based on our thinking impacting on our emotional state and also on our behavior. So we have that ability internally within ourselves to have an impact and almost, if you like, contaminate ourselves in that. And this idea of thinking being a big part of that is it's across many religions. It's definitely across much of our thinking and discussing around well-being and the importance of our thoughts, and an important aspect of that. And we have some nice examples of this within some of the research that has been done, concepts of learned helplessness in terms of kind of how we keep going, how we feel, how we manage failure and success are important as well. And this nice little research by a teacher who simply did two groups of children. One group of children had two very difficult problems that couldn't be solved, and a third one that was easy. The other group had three easy ones. And in two problems, children learned not to try the third one. So we are very susceptible to learning sort of, I suppose, self-doubt, learned helplessness, feeling that we can't achieve something. So failure is sort of inbuilt as something that we will quickly learn, much more than being primed for success. That seems to be just part of our human nature. So the importance of thinking and remembering and that we accept and learn the negative, the deficit, the what we can't do more easily than the positive and our strengths. And so learning to feel constructively is an important aspect of how we build our societies, but also the importance of keeping reinforcing messages of positivity and of success in order to combat messages of failure. We have the opposite effect and an ability to oppose that negativity by being able to send positive messages to ourselves. So another example was a study done by Brooks in 2014 where people were going out to do a performance, and there were three groups. Someone said, one group that did I feel anxious before they went on stage, another group that did I feel calm, and another group that talked about feeling excited. So, the question is, which group performed the best? And you might think, well, it might be the I feel calm group, because obviously if we can kind of get ourselves calmed down, that might allow us to perform at our best. But it wasn't that group, it was the I feel excited group. And the reason for that is that our body response in terms of kind of thinking patterns and worrying about going on and having that arousal is there anyway. So we will have those butterflies, we'll have those sweaty palms, and trying to persuade ourselves that we feel calm in the wake of that just doesn't work. Whereas actually we often have those similar symptoms if we feel excited. So in terms of combining messages that make sense to ourselves as a whole, both in terms of our physiological presentation and also our thinking, you need to match those two together in order, I suppose, to be able to believe that ourselves. So we know that we can have different emotions and different feelings if we change kind of how we perceive that in the context. And from that last experiment, we know that we can actually create our own internal context. We can change our story, if you like, about what's about to happen and how we feel about that, if we by changing some of our thinking around that. So we know that there's certainly things that we can do on an individual level that can have an impact on us, and that it's the idea of self-contamination. But maybe more interesting is the idea that there are contagion effects within our groups, that we find ourselves both behavioural and emotional. And there are a number of psychological theories that kind of contribute to that, things like observational learning theory, in terms of we do what we observe, and that is kind of contagion at a very individual level, and can see that with our children as they watch us and copy us and copy each other as well. And again, we often observe and note that bad behaviours are potentially more contagious than some of the good ones. And also there's a lot of work being done now about sort of social contagion theories around, more maybe based on kind of how do we influence, where does the ability to influence in terms of our groups, our societies, the organizations and the cultures in which we live. And that sort of idea of social contagion is maybe more specific to an environment that we find ourselves in. So we can have different kind of behaviours or attitudes or emotions across different environments. And I think we begin to see some of that clearly in terms of sometimes the Twitter behaviour that we observe, or we hear people talking about toxic teams or someone in a toxic relationship. And I suppose by that we're almost making that assumption of it's not how they always are. And so there's something about that sort of social contagion in that environment that we find ourselves that can be applicable, and isn't necessarily a permanency to it, but is and that's positive, because then we potentially have the ability also to influence change in that. So if we think a bit about behavioural contagions, there's the physiological work that's been done in terms of there are some things that we physiologically display that are very contagious, and we know that in terms of laughing and smiling. If you look into Google YouTube and look at laughing contagion, you get great. There's one on a tube which is fantastic, and you'll giggle as soon as you start to watch it. And I think what's really amazing is that as soon as we hear or see laughter, our brain automatically prepares our own facial muscles to have a response to that. And the positive impacts of that shared laughter, that contagion effect, are significant, as has been noted there. So even in small contagions of a small behavioural effect, like a smile, like a laugh, we can actually see benefits, or negatives, in terms of we can also, frowning is contagious, yawning is contagious, itching is contagious. So there's some things we seem to almost be set up to easily catch in terms of our physiology. And we know from the work done in neuroscience now is that our brains are hardwired for these connections. We actually have what are called mirror neurons, which actually are triggered in these pathways. So when we see a smile or a frown or a yawn there, these mirror neurons get triggered to then display that back. And those also can serve not just to trigger that kind of behavioural contagion, but also to trigger an emotional contagion that can be associated with it. And it's not just in our physiology and that kind of how we move our muscles, but also behaviourally and in our attitudes. We know that we can see the contagion of some of that. So there is a lot of kind of, we base our behaviours on what we see others doing. And I think, the toilet roll buying is a really good example of that, actually. And even on a personal level, how even when you know the kind of science behind it, even when you know that you've got plenty of toilet roll at home. I remember going around Tesco's and just taking my own 9-packet just because it looked like there wasn't much left on the shelf, and so you can see how we are easily drawn into that contagion effect, and it's difficult to kind of pull out of that. And things like decreased buying of Corona beer, if you see everybody else has left on the shelf, must be something wrong with that, will not bother. Or if we're on holiday, sometimes looking for somewhere to eat, you'll often choose busy restaurants because you think, well, everybody else is in there, that must be good. So these kind of just day to day in the passing way that we can kind of influence each other's behaviour, which may not necessarily have an impact in the longer term. But there are other studies that have been done looking at things like workplace rudeness, for example, or misconduct within the workplace, which have much more serious impacts in terms of culture and organisational behaviour, and impact on sort of productivity, impact on good care delivery, all of those things, which maybe we need to be paying more attention to understand how can we change spread, what is it that impacts on that. And certainly one of the things that seems to be coming out in the studies is that kind of behavioural contagion of negative attitudes or negative behaviours often is linked to perceived or observed outcomes. So what happens when people behave rudely, or whenever they behave in a way that is unprofessional or veers into misconduct, we are observing what happens to them, and we will make decisions about how we behave based on perceived outcomes for them. And often, sometimes these can be things in organisations that aren't dealt with, or that's the perception of onlookers, and therefore that creates more of that type of behaviour. I was interested in the fact that misconduct had a social multiplier of 1.59. And actually, probably in the past, I certainly wouldn't have paid attention to that figure. But again, now, because of COVID, we're a little bit kind of attuned to, wanting to be below 1. And I was thinking, like in that, 1.59 would nearly trigger lockdown in terms of COVID, but actually what do we do in terms of misconduct or rudeness spreading within our organisations, knowing the negative impact that it can have in terms of outcomes for our organisations. How do we institute lockdown? Or lockout, or something that impacts and changes and prevents the spread of that? Do we have systems in place to manage that? The social contagion research has shown impact in other areas such as obesity, smoking or not smoking, and actually not just in sort of the kind of contagion effect of 1-to-1. So it's actually not just in direct contact. What they've found in a lot of the research is that it sort of maintains its significance in terms of contagiousness up to 3 degrees of separation. So kind of our friends can actually be impacted on that. So there was a study done, Christakis would do quite a lot of the work in social contagion. He's worth looking into if you're interested. But groups of interconnected people who stopped smoking in concert, and you could see that spread right out to 3 degrees of separation, and the smokers within those groups becoming increasingly marginalised. And we don't just catch behaviours, we also catch emotions. And some of the research would suggest that emotional contagion is maybe more connected to physical proximity, or people who live together. But there are also gender connections. So we're more likely to catch an emotional contagion from a perceived same gender person. So that's important to think a little bit about as well. Just observing others in work who are stressed, even if we weren't feeling like that ourselves, can increase our own stress levels. There's some interesting studies in terms of mice and stress, where a stressed mouse was introduced with another mouse, and that other mouse caught the stress, even though it had not been subjected to the same stressful conditions in the first place. So we can see that we can catch emotions in the same way as we can behaviours. Thankfully, but there are kind of positive emotions, positive behaviours that can be caught as well. And there's work being done in terms of looking at kindness as contagious or happiness as contagious, and that kind of same factor of 3 degrees of separation seems to remain connected to that. So if you're happy, your friend has a 25% higher chance of kind of feeling joy or being happy themselves, but it has an impact on their friends and in the friends of their friends, even though I may not actually have had any contact with them. We can see that spread, if you like, and so we have that ability to impact outside our own social circles, our own social connectedness, and the importance of that. So how do we kind of use, I suppose, that knowledge that we have and that we're building up a really significant evidence-based understanding, how we influence, what are the factors that contribute to that, things like authority, things like likability, things like, well, if I do this for you, I'll do this, you do this for me. There are lots of factors that can influence, if you like. And in a world where I'm a social influencer seems to be a job, how do we use some of the psychology of all of this alongside this construct or this idea of positive psychology, and how can we spread, I suppose, ideas and concepts and language around meaningful lives and strength-based language that might help promote more of these positive effects moving forward. So I suppose the first thing I want to say is this is about balance. It's not about dismissing the challenges. I think sometimes when we talk about things like positive psychology and strengths-based approach, we can, people who are under pressure, and all of us can feel challenged by that, as if, well, that's almost just sweeping the challenge under the carpet. And that's not what positive psychology is at all. It doesn't stop doing all the things that we do to address inequality, to support those in need, to master and prevent challenge from arising, to support trauma, and all those things we continue to do. But it's also remembering that there is another side to everything, and that we need to support both sides of the balance in order to provide balance. So it's embracing the positives as well. And in doing that, remembering that it's not one for one. So it's not kind of one positive conversation and one deficit conversation, because we've already talked about the fact that we're attuned to negativity much more. So we pay by nature more attention to the negative. So we need stronger positive conversations, more of them, more frequent, more focused, more strongly held, in order to actually counterbalance our natural affinity towards the negative. So positive psychology talks about sort of three main areas in terms of what are our positive individual traits. So we often are very good at answering the questions of at interviews, what's the things that, are your weaknesses, but actually often find it much more difficult to talk about, well, what are our strengths? So actually, can we identify where our strengths are, what they are, and build on those in terms of challenge? The positive experiences that are there, sometimes we might feel we have to dig quite deep to find them, but that the whole work that's been built up around the importance of gratitude and how that can actually prove and increase our resilience and our well-being if we can practice gratitude even in some of the very difficult situations that we can find ourselves. But again, it's not just about the individual. And I think if we begin to have conversations around positive psychology, we need to learn the lessons of the conversations around resilience and compassion. That in order for this to be individually taken on and not rejected, it has to be about positive institutions. This is about a community challenge. It's a society challenge. It's an organizational challenge. It's a team challenge. It's about us in the groups that we live, being able to do this together and not just expect ourselves to take these messages on. So what are positive emotions, and it's important that we're, and what is it that we're trying to, I suppose, aim towards? This is not about happiness, if you like. And actually in my other slide, when we looked at the contagion of happiness, one of the things that the research showed is that it's transitory. The contagion effect of happiness is transitory, and that's because happiness as an emotion is a transitory state. So we can feel happy, but it isn't that we're going to then feel happy all the time. It is, and I think that's the importance of the difference between kind of emotional states versus kind of the traits that we might have. So contentment might be a trait. It might be kind of part of kind of what we can look to be on a day-to-day basis, but happiness is a state that we find ourselves in. And often we're aiming for the states, the transitory measures, rather than necessarily thinking about, well, what is it I want to build into my life? And so positive psychology thinks in terms of timelines as well. So the kind of emphasis a little bit on what the past and the acceptance of the past, and the importance of being able to put the past in the past, find ways of kind of not necessarily putting it away or not, but how do we leave some things in the past so that they're not influencing the decisions that we make in the future, or influencing our hopes for the decisions that we make in the present, or influencing our hopes for the future. And very much that focus on meaning making for the present, that actually the meaning we attach to what we do, how we live our lives today, is a big contributor to our experience of that life as being positive as well. And having some ability to keep alive hope for the future is a big part of that influence of positive psychology. So these ideas of the times and the timelines in which our lives are lived, and the importance of what we do in each of those timelines, having a focus in that timeline, and not confusing them together. We're not hoping around the past, because actually we have not an ability to change that, but we do need to maintain hope for the future, and we don't want to just be looking for trying to achieve meaning of our lives in the future. Sometimes we do, well, when I get to this, then actually I will feel content, but looking to find the meaning in what we're doing in the present are important aspects and lessons within positive psychology. And I suppose a lot of kind of the conversations around making meaning are often tied up in storytelling. And I think that in a kind of Northern Ireland context and in an Irish context, we're very, we are narrators, so that the kind of storytelling tradition in terms of, as groups, socially in our organizations, we tell stories, and actually the stories that we tell kind of provide, I suppose, the narrative in which we then live or find ourselves. So how do we kind of look at the meaning in which we are grounding our stories, or the sense of purpose that our stories give us, or the sense of hope that our stories instill for the future? Can we look at the stories that we tell and see how do they contribute to a kind of positive psychology narrative or a positive psychology agenda? And I was thinking one of the aspects of it is kind of thinking of a meaningful job. And we do some work on learning disability, and we're always talking about kind of meaningful activities and the importance of those. But actually, that's for us all. All of us need to have a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning. Full activity in what we do. And there was something recently on social media that I noted that in terms of a mum who'd put something on her Facebook page around, at night she always sought to make sure that the lunches were ready and everybody's clothes were ready for the next day. And sometimes that might mean she went to bed a bit later. And actually there was quite a barrage of negativity around that, and kind of quite judgment in terms, I suppose, of a feminist agenda, and quite negative comments in terms of her partner. And I did think, it's really important for us to be very cautious in terms of what our judgment is, in terms of what other people find meaningful. And that we're careful that sometimes in our PC world, or in our view of what we would hope and aspire to ourselves versus what we want and aspire to for each other, that we don't denigrate things that have meaning for each other and for other people, even though that might not be the same feeling of kind of meaning making for me. So that the kind of care that we need in terms of being cautious about how we use agendas, and sort of the impact that that might have on things that are meaningful for others in that context. And in terms of positive psychology, one of the other areas that came up recently when I was looking at the literature was actually the role of faith. And I think, again, that, in Northern Ireland context, it's a challenge, isn't it? That's kind of always been a bit of a difficult conversation, but actually, there's quite a lot of sort of research showing the importance of faith and our spirituality, that aspect of our lives and ourselves that can be quite important, and actually can have a huge amount of meaning and hope for the future attached to it. So again, in areas that are difficult, sort of as part of our society or our cultures, how do we make sure that we don't lose the potential for good and for real impact on our lives, just because they might be challenging conversations. So I guess I want to acknowledge again that actually the reducing stigma, particularly around both mental and physical well-being and health, and having better well-being conversations, acknowledging the challenges that we face and that some people face significantly more than others, how we support ourselves and each other remains very important. And the role of positive psychology and looking at social contagion in no way negates the need to continue to have those. But it's also important sometimes that we think a little bit about what we want for the future. The kind of old definition of insanity and doing the same thing that we've always done and expecting a different outcome remains true and important. And if we want some new results, then perhaps we need to think a little bit about a new mindset. And actually, from a brief kind of review of some of the work that's out there in the world of the science of psychology, both in terms of kind of our emotional management, the contagion effect of our emotions and our behaviours, and the impact that all of this can have on our lives. Those are important aspects for us to be including in our conversations, whether that be about community development or healthcare development or social care development, something around how do we have conversations that change the potential in our futures. And I like the C.S. Lewis quote, we can't go back and change the beginning. And for many of us and for many of the people that we serve, the beginnings have not been easy or good, and they've had a significant amount of challenge. And I guess what lots of the time in our communities and in our families and in our health and social care worlds, we are looking to try and start from where we find ourselves and see whether we can change the ending by the work that we do and the conversations that we have. So if we want a new ending, then maybe some of the questions that we need to start asking ourselves is, well, what's the new story? What do we aim to spread? Can we reach a goal if we don't have a path? And maybe particularly importantly, can we have one voice? We've kind of had that conversation around you know, that sort of, if we split and we have negative messaging and we're trying positive, we'll always be drawn towards the negative. So how can we hold some of that meaning together? How can we make decisions about what our focus and priority will be, even though some of the things that maybe aren't at the top of those are things that cause dissent? So we maybe need to change our storytelling a little bit, because currently we do have a deficit conversation. We achieve things by what we don't have, and that lends the conversation then to remain in deficit or in negativity. So in order to, I suppose, change conversations, we need courage, because that will involve us challenging ourselves and each other. In order to have that courage and to be safe to do that, then our connections need to be strong and safe. And we need to have cooperation in agreeing what our priorities and what our narratives, what our storytelling messages will be. And we need to have choices in terms of, you know, of what we choose to focus our energy and attention on. And we need to maintain compassion for each other, because we will get it wrong and we will revert to old ways, and we will need to go back to that courage and challenge. But we have to hold to, I suppose, a hope and a faith that we can affect change, and that we can change the narrative and the kind of future that we wish to have. And ultimately, I suppose the big important aspect for us all to take away individually and collectively is that our attitudes, our behaviours, our emotions are contagious. Is mine worth catching? Is yours worth catching? And if we all keep that in mind a little bit more on a day-to-day basis, then perhaps what we spread will be more helpful to the societies and groups, and to the people with whom we live. Thank you for your time.